We're in Ephesians chapter 4. We finally finished up chapter 3 last week. And I put the last message from Paul's prayer online today. And so now we're in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. I like moving forward in the Bible the way that we do, one verse at a time, one chapter at a time, instead of jumping all over the place, so we can get the full intent of the purpose and the message of a letter that was written. When Paul sat down to write the letter to Ephesus, more than likely he sat down and started writing and wrote until he got done with the letter. He didn't write some to Ephesus and turn around and write some to the Romans and turn around and write some to the Galatians. He wrote the letter as a whole, and that's the intent of the way it was intended to be read as a whole. So turn to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 1, and once you find that, please stand and we'll read it. We're just reading the first two verses of chapter 4 together. We certainly could read more than that, but if we're going to understand the unity that he's calling for in verses 3 through 6, then we've got to understand the purpose of that unity. And verses 1 and 2 give us the purpose, the reason that we need to have that unity. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. The title of the message today is to think about your walk. Think about your walk. He says, I therefore, the prisoner of the master, beseech you that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called, with all lowliness and meekness and longsuffering, forbearing one another in love. And he goes on to say that we ought to strive for unity. And but I want to talk about this that we be worthy, that we walk worthy of the vocation wherewith we were called. I'm going to talk about that today, this afternoon, as we meet together. So let's go to prayer and ask the Father to bless this time. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, it seems like it would be real easy to open your Word and to find a meaning and to preach that thing, and maybe it should be real easy, but I know for me sometimes it's very difficult. So I pray that you would strengthen me. I pray that you would fill my mouth with the words that you would have me to say. I pray that you would use me today and help me to walk worthy in this ministry of pastoring and preaching a sermon. Help me to walk worthy of that ministry in the things that I say today to these people that have gathered here for your purpose. I pray that you would help us to pay attention, to listen to what it is that you say, not necessarily what I say, but what you say. Help us to question and seek truth in all things that we believe. And all this I ask in the name of Yahushua Messiah. Amen. You may be seated. The calling, he talks about the vocation wherewith ye are called. And that word vocation, it seems like it's talking about a job. We use that term vocation to imply a job. Like Buck, his vocation is he works for Tyson, and he works in the material handling shipping department. And some people would say, well, that's what that word vocation means, but that's not really what it means. I was talking to, I think it was Mrs. Bontrager, Deanna, and I was saying how things in the Bible, they say things, and they use English words that today don't mean the same thing as they meant when they first used them. And vocation's a good example of that. Because vocation comes from the idea that something is going to be pronounced, that something is going to be spoken, or that an invitation is given. We use the word invitation to mean what vocation means there. We'd say, I'm going to send you an invitation to come to my kid's birthday party or come to, a wedding or something. We'd send an invitation, but back then that's what the word vocation meant. It meant a proclamation of some sort, an invitation of some sort. And so if we're going to understand that, then we have to understand that we've been invited or called to do a certain thing. And that we need to find ourselves, as he says, that ye walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called, that you're worthy of whatever he's called you to do. That as you do it, and because he's the one that called you, we need to make sure that as we walk it out, we're doing it worthily. And, our calling is multifaceted. Like the Father doesn't just call individuals, he also calls groups. which is very interesting. For example, collectively, our assembly, our congregation is called to keep the Sabbath. There's an expectation that we together will keep the Sabbath. As a matter of fact, there's no way that we could keep the Sabbath the way that the Bible calls us to if we don't have an assembly, if we don't have the convocation that it calls for in the Old Testament. Leviticus 23:3 says that the Sabbath is a holy convocation for us. That part of keeping the Sabbath is not just the rest, but also the opportunity to fellowship and to read from the Bible and speak about the things that the Father's commanded us. We have a collective calling to keep the Sabbath. We have collective callings in keeping the feasts. If you're not familiar with the feast, read Leviticus 23. It talks about all the feasts, including the Sabbath. And there's a collective calling upon this body to do things collectively together to accomplish a goal. The Great Commission could be said to be given to individuals, but it's also given to us as a body. The Bible says that the reason that we join together, Paul says that describes the reason for us to come together and to fellowship and to assemble is to sharpen one another and to equip the saints. We're specifically supposed to be equipping one another. These callings are placed upon us as a body, but not all callings are. There are individual callings. For example, that we have a homeless ministry. And the Father laid that on somebody's heart way before they ever were a part of this convocation, this assembly. And since they've become a part of this assembly, there have been others that have also felt an individual calling to accomplish this goal. But we don't all go as a collective group every single time it happens, and we don't all worry about it to the same capacity or feel as to the same capacity called to do this. We have jail ministries where Brother Buck and I, we go to the jail. But not everybody in this group goes to the jail. And there's been times that Buck's had to go to the jail by himself because I couldn't make it, or times I had to go to the jail by myself because he couldn't make it. And that's an individual calling that Buck and I both felt the Father is calling us to do. This ministry, this vocation that He's calling us. And you know, there's a cooperative effort between those individual callings and the group calling. There's, for example, in Buck and I's effort to go to the jail, we do look for opportunities to not only share the gospel with people, but we look for opportunities to help them walk out what's right once they get out of jail, which means inviting them to come to our congregation, inviting them to keep the Sabbath. And so we accomplish some of that group calling on an individual basis. And so when I say our calling or our vocation is multifaceted, I want you to understand that there's not just like, oh, well, he's a pastor, he's the only one in here with a calling. Or, hey, they go to the homeless, they're the ones with the calling, and we're just all in support of that. No, we are all each called to do something. And we might be called to be a mom or a dad or a son or a daughter, but we're all called towards something. And the important thing is that Paul isn't talking about a pastor here. He's talking about you and I. He's talking about the individuals and the group as a whole. That there's not anyone here that if they were redeemed by the Holy Spirit, by the shedding of the blood of the Messiah, there's nobody here that if they were redeemed that doesn't have a purpose that the Father has for your life. And that purpose is active right now, whether you respond to it or not. Your purpose, the Father has a reason for you to be here, and it's active. Are you active? That's a good question. Well, if you become active, let's say that we all discover and are walking out that purpose that He has for us, that vocation wherewith we are called, then we probably ought to walk that out worthily. And so the message today deals a lot with how to be worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called. Because he says that we ought to walk it out worthy, right? Doesn't he say? He says that we should walk worthy of the vocation with which we are called. We have to be worthy of that. Now there's a difference between being worthy of something and being qualified for it. You know, a lot of people, they look at me and they say, you're not qualified to be a pastor. And I say, you're absolutely right. Worthy is what we become in our calling before we're called, and being qualified is something you have to be before you are called. A good example of being found worthy is David. David was not a soldier. He showed up one day to feed his brothers who were soldiers. He was not trained. He was not qualified to be a soldier. He was young. But when he got there, and Goliath stood across the valley on the far side and was calling out curses and cursing the name of Jehovah, the name of Yahweh, When Goliath was over there cursing, David may not have been qualified to be a soldier, but I think once he started to walk across that valley and pick up them stones, he walked worthy of the calling and the vocation that the Father placed on him. It wasn't that he changed David into a grown man with a sword and a shield and all of the accoutrements of being a soldier. No, what he did is he transformed that young man into nothing more than a young man. But he walked out that calling worthy of it and defeated Goliath and overcame the fact that he wasn't qualified to do what he just did. Being worthy is what happens to us after we start the endeavor. Right now, we're keeping the Sabbath, or we're trying to. I mean, obviously we're here, so we're keeping part of it. We're convocating. You're called to keep the Sabbath. We believe that. We believe that we're each one called to keep Sabbath, or we wouldn't be here. But do we walk it out worthy? Are we actually looking at what is required of keeping the Sabbath and applying that to our lives and walking it out worthy? Because I'm going to tell you something. We need to be worthy of this calling. You're feeding the homeless. That's great. You're taking care of the homeless. That's great. Walk it out worthy. Be worthy of that calling. You're going to the jail ministry. You got to be worthy of that calling. And that means that once you endeavor to walk that out, you're going to have to do some self-evaluation. You're going to have to be determined. David was not qualified to defeat Goliath, yet he was worthy of the task. He accomplished the task, and he glorified the Father once he was done. Now, on the other hand, Messiah was qualified to spend eternity with the Father. It says that in Philippians 2:6. It says, well, let's just look there. I'll probably misquote it. I really hate to misquote things. It says, who being in the form of Elohim thought it not robbery to be equal with Elohim. He was qualified, completely qualified to be in heaven. Completely. He was qualified before he ever left the earth. He was qualified before he ever gave his life. He was qualified all the way through. That's not me. And that's not you. He's not asking us to be qualified to do. Some people wait. They say, if I could just overcome this sin, if I could just fix this thing in my life, if I could just bring myself to a place where I feel like I would have respect, then I'll do the thing that the Father asked me to do. And I'm here to tell you that if the Father wants you to do it, then start doing it and make yourself worthy of that calling. Moses was a murderer. He wasn't qualified to be a judge of Israel, and he certainly wasn't qualified to be the greatest judge of Israel, and yet he walked it out worthily, didn't he? We need to be worthy. We need to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith we are called. We need to be worthy of that invitation of the Father to say, hey, I'm choosing you to serve me. We need to be worthy of that. Ministry is about worthiness, not being qualified. Your walk as a father, you are not qualified. There's not a father in here that's qualified to be a father of his kids. Nobody. We mess up, don't we? We messed up before we ever even had them a lot of times. But whether you were qualified when you became a father or not, now it's your time to walk it out worthy of the vocation wherewith you were called. Ministry is about worthiness, not qualification. No one is qualified. There's only been one person ever qualified to do what the Father assigned him to do, and that was the Messiah. Everybody since then has been unqualified. So make yourself worthy. And you need to examine yourself. You need to look at yourself, and you need to determine whether or not you're worthy. And fortunately, Paul, being as wise as he was, and being filled with the Spirit that he was filled with, and being inspired by the Father, said that there's a way to make yourself worthy. In the next verse, verse 2, he says, with all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, forbearing one another in love. He gives us a list. And this list is not a list of actions, but a list of attitudes. He's not saying, okay, first you've got to start tithing, and you've got to start, eating clean, and you've got to stop lying, and you got to clean up your life. You got to stop doing these things and start doing those things. That's not what he says. He says you need to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called with all lowliness. Walking in lowliness makes us worthy of the vocation we're called. And this lowliness is specifically lowliness of mind. It is the exact opposite of pride. We need to develop an attitude about ourselves that we understand that we are not qualified, that you are not good enough, that you will never be good enough to deserve the Father to use you in any way. It's not, you can't. You cannot ever be good enough. And yet He'll use you. Not because of how good you are, but how great He is. We need to have lowliness of mind. We need to understand that who we are. We need to understand where we stand. We need to understand who we are compared to not only the Messiah, but our Creator. He is great. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. He's everything. He's all powerful. And sometimes we get it in our head that we are all powerful. That our salvation was our effort, our work. That the Father loves us because of what we do for Him. When the fact is we do anything for Him because He first loved us. This is love. Not that you love the Father, but that He first loved you, right? That's the love. That's where it comes from. His power doesn't come from your obedience. His power comes from you recognizing that your obedience comes from Him. His power doesn't come from what you do right. His power comes from understanding that you do right as a gift from Him. It's His grace in your life that has empowered you to overcome your sin and to live in obedience. Lowliness. You have to understand that you deserve your salvation no more and no less than anybody else, even those that don't have it. You didn't do anything to earn this. You didn't do anything that makes you worthy of any ministry or use of Him. He's chosen to use you. He's chosen to use me. Not because Tim Evans is so great, but because He is so great. The miracle is not that He loved or that He hated Esau. The miracle is that He would love Jacob. The miracle is that He would love me and love you. The miracle is that the only thing that you ever contributed to your salvation was the sin that made it necessary. And the only thing that you can add to your salvation is Him and everything He can do in your life. That if you have stepped forward, if you have stepped up, if you have a ministry, if you have changed as a father or a husband, if you have changed as a son or a daughter, if you've changed as a wife or a mother, if you have made any strides in your life towards obedience and towards goodness and towards righteousness, it's because of Him. And until you adopt the proper mindset of who you are, lowliness of mind, until you recognize who you are, you can never fully appreciate Him for what He does. Because I'm going to tell you something. If you think that you woke up this morning because then you're never going to understand that you woke up this morning because of Him. If you think that the reason that you're not in the hospital like those people that are today is because of you, if you think that the reason you're not in prison right now, like so many are today, is because of you and the choices you've made, then you have cut Him short. It's because of Him. It's because of His work. It's because of His effort. It's because He's active. Because when I'm active, I sin. It's because He leads. It's because He's in front of and He's behind me. It's because of Him. It's because I'm encompassed in His love. And if we're going to understand who we are, then that will help us to walk worthy of that ministry. Because the moment you start thinking that you deserve to be a fill in the blank, Sunday school teacher, deacon, pastor, song leader, musician, the moment you feel like that you deserve, that you're qualified to do those things, is the moment that you stop walking worthy of doing it. Lowliness of mind. The next thing he says with all lowliness and meekness. That word meekness, it means gentleness. That we need to not be offensive. that we need to have a measure of self-control. If you're going to be worthy of the ministry, the vocation that you are called to do, if you're going to walk worthy of that, then you need to start developing a little bit of self-control. Because the biggest thing that'll ruin a ministry, the biggest thing 90% of the times is what comes out your mouth. That's why the Messiah says it's not what goes into your body that defiles you, but what comes out. He was talking to the Pharisees. And what the Pharisees were doing is they were teaching things that wasn't necessarily true. They were teaching for the commandments of God, their opinions, their traditions. And he says it's the things that are coming out of your mouth that's defiling you. It's not unwashed hands or unwashed plates. And I'm going to tell you something as a pastor, as somebody that goes into the jail ministry, as somebody who goes to see somebody in the hospital, as a father or as a mother, what's going to ruin your ministry faster than anything else is if you lack self-control. If you can't control the way that you talk, if you can't control the words that come out of your mouth. We talked about in the jail ministry just recently, in Psalm 10, it says that the wicked man's mouth is full of cursings. Isn't that what it says, Buck? It does. And we're not supposed to be that guy. We're supposed to be gentle. And if we're going to walk worthy of the things that the Father calls us to do, then we have to learn a little bit of self-control. We need to learn to be gentle in a very violent world. We need to learn to be measured and in control. We need to learn meekness. The Bible says that Moses was the meekest man that ever walked the earth. Moses. And we're talking about the same Moses, the one that parted the ocean, the one that when Korah and his family came to speak against Moses, the earth opened up and swallowed him. Yeah, that Moses, the one that was, constantly doing like these super great big things that a lot of times would end up killing a few people. We think of him opening the ocean and, oh good, he delivered the Israelites, but what we forget is that he closed the ocean back on the chariots and the Egyptians, and it killed a bunch of people. That's Moses, the meekest man that ever walked the earth. He wasn't meek because he never did anything violent or anything that would lead to harm or death of somebody else. He was meek because he only did that which was required of him. He exhibited self-control. He only did what was necessary most of the time. He didn't always do what was necessary, but he tried. His goal was meekness. His goal was power of God, not power of Moses. And I'm going to tell you that if you're going to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called, you're going to have to learn power of God versus power of self. There's going to be a lot of things that you can do yourself, but you ought not to do them. You've got to turn it over to the Father. Because you won't ever be able to walk out that ministry worthy of it if all you do is react. We need to learn meekness. And then he says long-suffering. Long-suffering from the Greek is a very interesting word. I really like the word that was translated to long-suffering. I actually studied on it quite a bit. Because long-suffering to me, we just say, oh, that's patience, right? Isn't that what patience is, long-suffering? But that's not what the word is in the Greek, and we're going to talk about that here right now, actually. Long-suffering. The Greek word is macrothumia. Macrothumia. Now, the interesting thing about Greek and Latin and like Spanish is that some of the words are very similar. Macro, I don't know. I've never heard that word in Spanish. Macro, we do know what macro means. So it means big. But thumia is very similar to the Spanish verb fumar. Fumar means what? Does anybody know? Fumar? No smoking, right? To smoke. Like they would put no fumo, right? No smoke. Yeah. And the word in Greek actually means fire or heat. Or it could also mean incense or smoke. The thumio is very interesting because it's macrothumio. Instead of long-suffering, this is great burning, great heat. And of course, because it's thumia instead of thumo, it means the opposite of. So, not great heat. That basically you should avoid being upset or heated or angered. And we associate that with patience. Certainly, when we have patience with our kids, sometimes we're just avoiding being angry, right? But not always. So patience is kind of a broad term that does kind of cover long-suffering, but specifically, you need to be willing to burn for a while. You need to be willing for people to hurt you, for people to apply heat to you. You need to be able to withstand that. And a lot of it, macro, not just a little, but a lot. You need to be willing to suffer, and hence the word long suffering. You need to suffer greatly. You need to be willing to suffer greatly for the ministry. If you're going to walk out your ministry and the first time somebody says something that you don't like, you throw in the towel and you say, hey, I don't need this. If you're easy to get your feelings hurt, then you do not fit into this category. And you are not worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called. You're going to have to be willing to endure a lot for what you've been called to do. And if my wife was in here, I'd say you can ask her. Being married to me is not easy. She's had to be willing to endure a lot to be married to me, to meet that calling in her life. But being married to anybody, really, don't you, in order for your marriage to work, don't you have to kind of be burned a little bit and be willing to withstand that? Be willing to withstand a little bit of anger, a little bit of heat, or even a lot of bit of heat in order for your marriage to make it? Don't you have to be willing to suffer a little bit in order for your marriage to not suffer? Don't you have to be willing to exhibit just a little bit of intolerance to pain almost? You have to be willing for somebody to say something that that hurts you and take it. Because your ministry is not your marriage, but your ministry is your duty as a husband or your duty as a wife. That's your ministry. And sometimes it's not easy to be a wife. And sometimes it's not easy to be a husband. And you can only walk out that ministry worthy if you can endure the heat. And it's going to be great heat. It's only if you can endure that anger and that wrath and those hard words. It's only if you're willing to endure those things that your marriage will survive. And I'm going to tell you, as a pastor, the only way that I would be able to do this is if I was willing to say, okay, throw trash at me. Dump your problems on me. Because there's times that's what it's like. And whether you're a pastor, or whether you're the song leader, or whether you're going to feed the homeless, whether you're going to the jail, you're going to have to be willing to suffer long if you're going to walk that ministry out worthy of it. Because if everything that happened in the jail, if it offended me and got me upset and made me reactionary, if I couldn't handle a little bit of harassment, then we're not going to last in there, are we, Buck? There's a lot goes on in there. People are not, they're typically very respectful, but not always. And they're typically very kind, but not always. And when they're not kind, they're not. You've got to be willing to do it. I tell you what, as a father, if I wasn't willing to endure the heat, and even great heat, then having teenagers would be beyond the scope of reasonability. But I was called to be a father of a teenager. Actually, now I've got 5 living in my home. And if I'm going to be worthy of that calling, then I'm going to have to be willing to not get angry at the things that would make normal people angry. I'd have to be willing to endure a little bit of heat, or even a lot of heat. Let me tell you something. He's telling you how you can walk worthy of the calling that was placed on you. He's telling you right here in verse 2 that you need to be lowly of mind, that you need to be gentle or meek, and that you need to be willing to suffer the heat, the great heat, in order to be worthy of that calling on your life. But he doesn't end there, does he? He says, forbearing one another. And this word forbearing comes from 2 Greek words. One is anna, and the other is echo. We know the word echo, don't we? We use that term. When we say echo, what we do is we're talking about when we speak into like a big empty room, and our voice carries back to us. And echo means echo means something similar to that usage of it. It really means to hold. And the reason we say that our voice echoes back is because the room holds our voice even after we're done speaking, and it keeps giving it back to us. It holds on to the voice. And so the word echo means to hold, and anna means up. And when it says that we should forbear one another in love, if you're going to walk out your ministry, you have to be willing to hold people up that are ready to fall. You're going to have to be willing and ready to be that person that is bearing the burdens and the sorrow and the mindset of those that are falling around you. And that especially is true here. And because it doesn't just say you have to be willing to forbear everybody. What does it say? Forbearing one another in love. Me walking worthy in my ministry means that I have to help you with yours. That means that if you're struggling with your ministry as a parent, then it's my job to hold you up. Or if I'm struggling in my ministry as a pastor, guess whose job it is to hold me up? It's yours. If your wife is struggling in her ministry as a parent, then it's her husband's job to hold her up in love. Not to sit there and say, well, you shouldn't have done this, and you shouldn't have done that, and you know what, if you'd have just listened to me. No, this is talking about saying, hey, honey, let's do it this way instead. Because I want you to be worthy of your walk, and I want to be worthy of mine. I want to be worthy, but I'm not always. And what helps is when there's somebody there to hold you up, right? And if you're a husband, you understand that your wife has held you up when times you were ready to fall and lose the worthiness of your ministry. And if you're a wife, you know that your husband has been there and held you up in your moment of falling in your ministry. But there are times when a wife's ministry to her husband is falling. And there's times when that husband, it's going to be really hard for him to hold her up. And what this is saying is if she falls, then you fall because you didn't hold her up in love. If in this congregation, one family falls, then we all fell because we did not hold them up. In this congregation, if we cannot walk together and lift each other up and bear one another's burdens and forbear in love for one another, then it's not just me that loses the worthiness of this calling that's been placed upon me. It's each and every one of us. And it's not just you, it's each and every one of us. Forbearing one another. So, the question is knowing this, knowing that we need to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith we are called. Now that you know that there's a worthiness requirement, if not a qualification, are you willing? Are you wanting an opportunity to represent the Messiah with your life? Are you really wanting that vocation, that calling? Are you really wanting the Father to look at you and say, hey, I want you to do this. I'm going to require this of you. Knowing that you are going to need to walk worthy. Knowing that you're going to have to change your attitude in order to be worthy. If not, what's wrong with you? I mean, seriously, if you are covered by the blood of the Messiah, He has died for you, He suffered, He lived everything with you in His mind, and you say, no, I don't want no ministries, I don't want to do anything for Him, then there's got to be something wrong with you. Do you think that He came and that He suffered and He died just so you could focus on yourself and what you want and what makes you happy? No, of course not. He did not redeem you so you could be the best you can be. He redeemed you so He could use you in the best possible way for His needs. And what we need to do is stop focusing on ourselves and what we want and start focusing on Him and what He wants and find that vocation that He's calling you to so you can walk worthy. There's so many people that will come to a church, whether it's on Saturdays or Sundays, and they got it in their head that showing up and sitting in a pew and maybe putting a little bit of money in the offering, and they've done everything that the Father has asked of them, that they're good followers of the Messiah. Now, I'm a Christian, I'm Christ-like. Yeah, that's who I am. Let me tell you something. Listening to a sermon doesn't make you anything better than what you were before you listened. You've got to do. There's a calling that you need to walk worthy of. Start looking around you. I bet you if you start looking around you, you will find that there are people that still need Yahweh. They still need His instructions. The Bible says that His instructions are health and life to us. They're health and life. Read the third proverb, the third chapter of Proverbs. It'll be health for your navel, right? Lean not on thine own understanding, but in all thy ways acknowledge Him, and it will be health for your navel. If you start at the beginning of the chapter, he starts off by saying, forget not my law. Don't forget my Torah. It's going to be health for your navel. His instructions are life and health for us. We have an obligation to those around us not living under those instructions, but living a life of death and defeat, to at least share with them that there's a better way of living. I'm not saying get into a knockdown, drag-out fight. I'm just saying there are ministry opportunities that we're not taking advantage of. Ministry starts with the proper attitude, with this idea of lowliness of mind, of meekness or gentleness, of long-suffering. We need to walk worthy. We need to evaluate the way we're walking in the ministries that we're involved in and determine whether we are walking worthy. And because I'm going to tell you something, the Bible says that if we are to strive for the masteries, we will not obtain them if we do not strive lawfully. And I'm going to tell you something, in your ministry, if you're walking and you're not walking worthy of that ministry, and you wonder why you see no souls saved, you see no lives changed, you see no converts of any kind to any kind of righteousness or morality, that basically you seem to be just throwing food at people or seem to just be talking to people and there's been no change. You might as well talk to the wall. Then maybe it's because you haven't been worthy of that walk that you've been, or that worthy of that vocation that you've been called to. If you do not want to know, if you do not want an opportunity to represent the Messiah, then your life is junk. Isn't that terrible? You think about it. He found you and you were trash. You were junk. You were unredeemed. You were the garbage of sin. You were unclean rags to Him. You were unclean and filthy when He found you. And if you are unwilling to walk out any ministry on His behalf, then you are still just as unworthy. You're still just as unredeemed. You're garbage. If you're living only for you, then you have no value. We are supposed to be His workmanship. We read this in Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 10 says, for we are His workmanship created in Messiah Yahushua unto good works, which Yahweh hath before ordained that we should walk in them. We're supposed to walk in them. We're supposed to be walking worthy of them. You're supposed to be His workmanship. The key word there is work. You're supposed to be doing something. If I bought a used computer but could not get it to work, it wouldn't do anything. Something was wrong with it and I could not fix it. How long would it be before I finally decided to just throw that computer out and get a different one? Christ said it this way. He says, you're the salt of the earth. And if the salt has lost its savor, then it's to be cast out in the street and trampled underfoot, because it ain't no different than sand. You know, the difference between salt and sand is the way that salt tastes. And if you have no different flavor than the rest of this world, if you do not change, if your salvation did not regenerate you and redeem you and make you useful, a work and workmanship of the Father, then guess what? You didn't get it. If you're still the same person today as the day you were saved, the day that you were trash and He redeemed you, and you didn't ever actually accomplish anything for Him, then I would start wondering how redeemed you really are. How redeemed are you if you're still the same trash that you were when He found you? If you're not doing anything different for Him and for the kingdom. Now, I'm not saying that anybody here is trash. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that anybody that listens to this sermon is trash. What I'm saying is that redemption changes us. And if your redemption hasn't changed you, then you probably ought to start looking to make sure you're redeemed. And if you are, then you probably ought to start working out that redemption in your life. you better start being redeemed, because something that's redeemed is something that was useless that becomes useful. Are you useful for Him? We need to start thinking about our walk. Together, individually, we need to start thinking about our walk. Let's all stand.